Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're hailing from. Welcome to another edition of Ask an OpenShift Admin. Today we are joined by a very special friend from VMware, Mr. Robbie Jerrom. If I said that wrong, I'm sorry. But Andrew, the cuddliest curmudgeon in the company, would you please introduce, yourself and what we're talking about today?
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. Yes, welcome to the Ask an OpenShift Admin Office Hour. You notice I had to glance over here. I still have to look at the title because I still want to say the OpenShift Administrator Office Hour.
I've decided to put the title in front of me from this point forward. Yeah.
Yeah. So, forgive me if I stumble over the name of the show because this is the third week.
Third week, I think.
Yeah, that we've had the new name. So yes, welcome. Thank you everybody for joining us today. This is one of the Office Hour series of live streams, which means that we are here for you. We're here in an Ask Me Anything style of interaction. We encourage you to ask us, well, literally anything about OpenShift, about administering OpenShift, about anything that's top of mind in that respect. And you can do that at any point in time across any of the platforms.
Yes.
We have some fancy technology that rebroadcasts.
Okay, yeah.
I know. Hey, it's
storage classes. You've been dealing with those for the past few minutes.
Actually, yes. So it rebroadcasts everything across all the platforms. So no matter where you are, we will be able to respond back and see that. In the absence of those questions, in the absence of things that are top of your mind, we generally have a topic. And today, as Chris highlighted when he opened today, that is OpenShift and VMware together. And I'm really happy to have Robbie on today. Robbie and I have been working together for, 2+ years now, which is kind of funny. Yeah, it's kind of funny because I have spent so much time with you on the phone and video chats and all that other stuff. I don't think we've ever actually met in person, which is kind of funny. So,
you're right there.
Yeah. So Robbie, if you don't mind, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Robbie Jerrom. I work at VMware and I talk about apps and platforms on vSphere in the varying flavors. And I've spent probably the best part of the last 2 years focusing quite heavily on OpenShift and working with Andrew and the engineering teams.
Yeah, and Robbie and I, we work together quite a bit because we are kind of each other's interface into the respective companies. So whenever VMware folks want to know about OpenShift things, he interacts with me and vice versa. Whenever I want to know about VMware things, I go through Robbie. So it's been really beneficial for both of us to learn a lot about the respective sides.
Joint therapy, we're okay,
yeah. So for anybody who is watching the stream, please feel free to ask questions. I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes here going over the top of mind things. So for anybody who is a regular watcher of the stream, right, I tend to spend a few minutes up front talking about the things that Andrew was wrong about last week, which nobody sent me any obscene emails telling me that I was horribly wrong.
Well, that's good.
And yeah, every once in a while it happens. And the other one is kind of things that have come up in the last week or so, things that I keep seeing internally and sometimes externally that I think are worth bringing up to you all, to our audience.
Externally.
So the first one is there was a pretty lengthy thread that happened this week about the difference between a OpenShift deployment that is mixed operating systems versus mixed architectures, CPU architectures. So with 4.7, we announced with vSphere, vSphere IPI, right? We can do Windows nodes inside of an OpenShift cluster. So CoreOS control plane, Windows worker nodes that are able to do all the things that they do. Absolutely fine, fully supported, nothing wrong with that, works great. What we can't do is mix, for example, a x86 deployment, so x86 control plane with power nodes or IBM Z nodes, right? Stuff like that. And we get that question somewhat frequently, especially from course, our peers at IBM. But unfortunately, all of the nodes have to be on the same CPU architecture. So just be aware of that.
I mean, and that's a core Kubernetes thing. And there's not much that I think anybody can do about that at the moment, right? Like mixed arch is hard. Period.
Yeah. So
right?
here, I'll post this into the chat. I have this Kubernetes issue bookmarked because I use it at least once a week. And this is the Kubernetes issue, the upstream issue where we can't mix different cloud providers essentially. So with cloud providers, what we're really referring to is infrastructure types. So I can't have some nodes that are deployed to vSphere and some nodes that are deployed to physical servers unless I do a non-integrated OpenShift deployment, right? So what used to be called bare metal UPI.
Yeah.
And that's just because it's a Kubernetes cloud provider limitation. It doesn't understand, it doesn't recognize when those nodes can't all be managed the same. So it just doesn't allow them to join the cluster. So second one, node auto scaling. This was a question that comes up somewhat frequently. Once every week or two, we get questions around, can I have a cluster preemptively scale based off of some sort of criteria? All right. So, hey, the cluster has hit 80% CPU threshold or 70% memory or whatever that means. Can we go ahead and provision some extra nodes using the IPI mechanism? The answer for that is, unfortunately, no, but maybe. So the cluster auto scale or the node auto scale mechanism doesn't work that way. It doesn't take action until pods fail to schedule. So I just submitted a job. That job needs 40 pods that have X amount of CPU or RAM, and at pod number 26, I'm out of capacity. Right, there is no more CPU available. Right, it needs to take action, so it'll start spinning up nodes to be able to schedule that. So if you wanted to do some sort of preemptive scheduling or preemptive scaling rather, there's a couple of ways you can do it. They're all basically the same, which is some sort of additional automation. So maybe that's creating a simple pod, right? It's some sort of automation that goes into a pod deployed to the cluster that is checking those metrics internally and just says, hey, does an OC scale or something like that against the machine set. And basically the same thing, but done externally, right? Something, your external monitoring system, whatever you happen to be using, that is watching those metrics and then taking action for you. So the last one that I have here is extracting ignition files. This was a fun one. So somebody asked me, hey, I accidentally broke my or deleted the installation folder for my cluster, and I need to add some more nodes. This is a UPI install. How do I get the ignition files so that I can add those nodes, right? Because you have to provide ignition. So how do I get that out of my cluster? So there is a command that we can use. Let me see if I can share screens here.
You can do it, I believe.
Sometimes it takes a little faith. All right, here we go.
Yes, always.
So I'm this is my cluster for today. Come on, cluster. This is a vSphere cluster. It is running on vSphere 6.7 U3, I believe. So it happens to be IPI, but really doesn't matter in this instance. So the command here is not that one. Let me pull this guy. So the command here is this OC extract command. So from the OpenShift machine API namespace, we're going to pull this secret / worker - user - data. And what we get is the ignition, right? So this would be what we, if I'm doing, vSphere UPI, this is what I would attach as that machine property. If I'm doing, bare metal or something like that, this would be what's hosted on that web server that we pass into that. And the same thing we can do for the control plane nodes. Just change this from, for example, worker to, I think it's master. Yep. So over to master, we pull out that one, so on and so forth. So super straightforward. I'll paste this command into the chat.
Thank you.
Oops. Well, I say that. And because I highlighted part of this over here, it
decided to.
Yeah. Thank you, macOS, for being overly helpful.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, those were the three things that I had today, or leading up into today. I do want to take a moment to highlight, very, very important, tomorrow at, is it 9 a.m., Chris?
10 a.m.
10 a.m. We will have the What's Next presentation streamed here on OpenShift.tv across all the various platforms.
All the platforms, yes, sir.
So What's Next is the roadmap presentation for OpenShift. So there's usually two of these that we do quarterly. So one is a What's New, which is what's coming in the next release. And then the What's Next, which is what's on the roadmap for a little bit further out. So I will be on the streams. I'm sure Chris will be on the streams as well, right? Answering questions. Anybody who's interested, please join. We will be, if we can't answer the questions, we'll take those and we will re-ask them internally.
Yes.
And we have multiple ways of harassing the product managers to get those answers. So don't hesitate to ask any questions that you have about what's coming in the roadmap for OpenShift. All right, that's enough of me rambling.
Yes, we already have a list of questions that I'm trying to pull back up over here.
So somebody, and I did not know that you could do this. So when we schedule these, especially now that we are a part of the Red Hat YouTube channel, they schedule these like a week or two in advance. And apparently you can come into that pending stream and you can chat from the time that it's scheduled. So somebody asked us a question like last week, which is pretty interesting to me. So I think we'll start with that question, and then I will come down through the rest of the chat here and see what we can answer before we get started talking about other things. So first, what about storage vMotioning happen on an OpenShift worker node, which is carrying VMDKs provisioned by the CSI driver? So essentially PVCs from the CSI driver. So some good news. We recently updated the documentation. Let me find my right tab here. And I will share this guy. All right, so we recently updated the OpenShift documentation. And if we scroll up here, I am on the OpenShift 4.7 docs. And this is just installing a cluster on vSphere. So we go to installing on vSphere and take the first option. And if we come down here, we have this using an OpenShift container platform with vMotion. So previously, the guidance here ranged from don't use vMotion, vMotion is not supported, to vMotion works and it's a support gray area, so you probably shouldn't do it. But now it is officially tested, it works, right? It's fully supported to do, and you can see here, compute only vMotion.
Right.
So the compute only is the important part here. Essentially, that's what's tested. They make some comments in through here about migrating with PVs and stuff like that and how it might change the references. I haven't verified this, but I think that is talking specifically about the in-tree provider. So remember, with an OpenShift deployment, with an IPI deployment or UPI deployment, we will automatically configure and use the in-tree vSphere storage provisioner. It's there out of the box, and that's the one that is fully supported by Red Hat. The CSI provisioner is different, right? You deploy that day 2, it is supported by VMware, etc. So my understanding is that this is true. This paragraph is true about we don't want you to do storage vMotion with in-tree PVCs. Robbie and I believe that, and Robbie, please speak up if I'm speaking out of turn, believe that this should work with CSI provisioned volumes. However, if you want to be absolutely sure and comfortable and not have any worries about it at all, I would definitely recommend doing a cordon and drain and doing that storage vMotion while the node is not hosting any workload. And if you really want to take it to the maximum, security or comfort level, turn that node off, right? Shut it down so that way it's a cold migration.
Yeah, and it's as you say, Andrew, with the new provider, if you've got that loaded in, I move nodes around all the time in my home lab and never have any kind of issue. But if you want to be absolutely in line with the support statement in the docs, that's what's in front of you right now. Your mileage may vary, but it does seem to work spot on. The new driver has got a lot of changes. It does have a different vSphere version, so you need to check your version numbers if you're going to be running with the new driver instead of the in-tree driver.
Yeah, and I should have asked you this before we started, Robbie, of checking to make sure that you have a cluster on vSphere 7 with the CSI driver. One of the things I'm hoping you'll show is some of that vCenter integration that comes with the CSI driver. Because I think we talk about that a lot, but we haven't often shown it. of, hey, as the vCenter administrator, I want to feel comfortable. I want to see the things that I have. If you don't have that, that's okay. We'll follow up with it and include
If you
it.
give me about 2 minutes, I can magically create one.
Magic. Gotta love magic. JP Dade, can we do a bare metal IPI vSphere installation of OpenShift 4.7 with Windows worker nodes? So bare metal would imply that, or bare metal IPI would imply that we are doing something like a VBMC or something like that. So no. Because I think what you're asking is, can I deploy some nodes to vSphere and some nodes that are maybe physical and some nodes that are Windows, maybe physical or virtual? And we can't mix like that. So you can do, and I'll take it further as Windows worker nodes are only supported either in Azure or on vSphere IPI.
Right.
Those are the only two platforms and the only two installation methods that Windows worker nodes are supported at all.
JP Dade clarifies he's on an HPE Synergy frame. It's all virtual.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your perspective, it would need to be a vSphere IPI deployment. Make sure you watch, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we had Christian on, maybe 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
We had Christian on the stream. He talked about Windows nodes. So there are some caveats there, right? Make sure you're using OVN, SDN with hybrid mode, so that way it'll work across the different operating systems, all that fun stuff. What do I get from the vSphere cloud provider other than storage? So that's a great question. And Robbie, please feel free to interject here as well. So there's a couple of things. So the cloud provider, which is responsible for really managing nodes in an IPI deployment, but can also work with UPI. So what do I mean by that? So the machine API and the machine config operator, et cetera, are designed or they use to create and destroy and configure nodes that are a part of the cluster. And the cloud provider, and cloud provider is a bit of an overloaded term, right? Depending on who you're talking to in Red Hat and certainly across other vendors in the industry, we sometimes use it to mean different things. But with OpenShift and with Andrew, so the cloud provider is that bit that talks to the underlying infrastructure provisioner or provider rather, and provisions, manages those nodes. It is available through UPI. Let me dig up the link here. Too many bookmarks.
Indeed. I'm having a really hard time searching for this episode. Let me just go find it somehow.
All right, so I will paste that into chat and then I will bring it up over here. So this KCS, how to create a machine set for VMware and OpenShift 4.5. And this is if you deploy using UPI and then you want to be able to do node scaling, right, using the cloud provider, right, the machine set paradigm inside of that cluster. So this will bring back or introduce some of the IPI requirements to your UPI cluster. So for example, with UPI, you can do static IPs, right? And you have to create the DNS entries, the load balancer, right, all of that other stuff. So when you introduce these machine sets, when you start doing dynamic node provisioning, you're going to have DHCP, right? Those nodes have to get their IPs from somewhere. And you'll want to be careful about how, in particular, the routers land across those nodes. And the reason I say that is because, well, we'll end up with, you could end up with a router that ends up on one of these new machine set provisioned nodes that hasn't been added to the load balancer. Because remember, it's UPI. The load balancer would be manually configured by you. So either use a load balancer that has an operator for integration, so that way it can dynamically update it, or create like an infrastructure machine set. So that way you always know where the routers are. You can always have the load balancer configured to point at those. But otherwise, it works great. And it's really good for that dynamic provisioning that you want to, right? Dynamically scaling the cluster up and down that you want to be able to do, while also being able to take advantage of your external enterprise load balancer instead of, the IPI keep alive D thing that we have there. So please, hopefully that answered your question. I think that was Waleed. Yeah.
Yeah, Waleed.
Yeah. So if that didn't answer your question, please feel free to follow up. I see that you, can you talk about machine API, machines, and machine set if we were using UPI? So yes, very quickly. So machine API, machines and machine sets effectively don't apply with UPI unless you're doing something like this, right? Where you're creating that machine set after the fact. So that doesn't exist for all providers. I think, actually, I don't know. That's a good question. I think the only one that it's documented for, because the only one that we've really been asked for that I'm aware of is with VMware.
Yeah.
So yeah, but normally with UPI, without day 2 configuring this machine set configuration, those things wouldn't apply. Essentially, they'll show up as
There's a
empty.
quick one. There's a quick one, Andrew, back on the CSI topic. Just come through chat, saying, yeah, shouldn't we use CSI and forget the built-in driver? Taking out the built-in driver, taking out the entry driver is a bad idea. I don't know, Andrew, whether you want to speak to that.
I will say it's not possible because the cluster storage operator will ensure it's always there.
Yeah, it puts it back, and I think it's tied quite closely with the registry. So you can put them both in, and you can change the default. So you can change the default to the new vSphere driver, which is going to give you the integrations into vSphere and vCenter, and visibility into the provisioned VMDKs and PVs up into vCenter. But don't spend too much time trying to delete the existing CSI, because the operator is going to put it back, and it's going to upset your cluster a little bit if you do successfully manage to remove it. So change the default, yes. Don't delete the existing one that's in there.
Yeah, and I would say, and Robbie, I think you'll agree with me, I would encourage folks to use the CSI driver.
Yeah, absolutely.
The integration with vCenter, just the general improved capabilities, especially if you're also a vSAN user, right? Just the general improved capabilities and reporting and everything there. You know, snapshots, the RWX, the file modes. What's the word I'm looking here for, Robbie? With vSAN.
Yeah, we've got the vSAN integration. You can tie it to storage policy, so you can set your encryption levels and stuff like that. You can have a number of different policies that will let you have different numbers of copies on vSAN and stuff like that. So you've got far more control if you're using the new driver. And then you've got other access to some of the new stuff. If you're on the VCF platform, you can use some of the file access and stuff like that as well, which is quite new, and I don't think we've spoken about before. So maybe we'll do another session on that another time. So that was fine.
I have a whole line of VMware shows that I hope to get to someday. So I'm kind of going in order here. So forgive me if you've asked questions and we haven't gotten to them yet.
I've got them all taken down here as notes.
Okay.
By the way,
so Daniel asked, with a cluster installed using UPI before static IP is easily available, can we replace DHCP with static IPs? Yes, but no.
Yes, but yeah.
So yes, you can. The problem is doing it is messy. And by that, I mean, the way to do it inside of the cluster post deployment is to either create a machine config for the nodes, right? And then for each node, right, have a machine config that goes in and drops something into Etsy sysconfig network-scripts or into the network manager directory, right? That tells it what its static IP is. That gets messy because now I have to have a machine config for each one of my nodes. And now I have to, potentially have a machine config pool for each one of my nodes. And it's not nice. So the other way, as of 4.7 in tech preview, you have the nm state operator. So you could use nm state to go in and reconfigure that interface to give it a static IP address. So the recommended way of doing it, for better or for worse, is to reload the nodes. Take them down one at a time, reload, use the VM property. Now that we can use the VM property to add that static IP information and do it that way. So I know that that's not the most friendly or the most ideal way, but sometimes I have to remind people that we treat CoreOS as an appliance and as disposable. So when you want to make super low level config changes, and the IP address for that first primary interface, the one that's on the machine network subnet, that's one of those low level things that we really want to treat a little bit carefully with that type of stuff. We don't want to. So I hope that answered your question, Daniel. Excuse me, man, I can't talk today. Waleed, not just vMotion, it's also DRS that was rescheduled VMs based on utilization. So I know this isn't a question, it's a statement, but I really want to touch on something important here. And Robbie and I have been talking about this for, well, basically 2 years. And that is, what is the relationship between nodes deployed, OpenShift nodes deployed to VMware or to vSphere with DRS, with resource reservations, and that type of resource management type of principles? So I'll ask you, Robbie, right? How should we configure those things?
Carefully. No, it's actually fairly straightforward. So with ESX, vSphere clusters, the system's looking after the CPU and memory for you. So when you deploy a VM onto the cluster, it's going to give you the resources and balance them based on everything else that's running on that cluster or on that ESXi host. If that host starts to become resource constrained, so you're using up too much memory or too much CPU, workloads will get pulled back, and you might not get as much CPU, or you might become memory constrained. That will impact the performance of the application. In this case, OCP. If it slows down too much, OCP is going to get upset and think that there's a problem with a node or a master, and it's going to try and resolve that. So if you use a resource pool, you can allocate a certain amount of dedicated resources to your masters, for example, or to a particular set of workers, and say, absolutely, for these virtual machines, I want to guarantee that they will always have at least 16 gigabytes of RAM or 32 gigabytes of RAM. And that's going to have no impact whatsoever on resource management unless the ESXi host starts to become resource constrained, in which point you're always going to have 16 gigs allocated to the VMs that are in your pool, and you're going to be good with that. Now, the subset of that is there's a concept of shares, where you can actually sub-allocate even further and say, of that 16, these particular VMs have shares. Most people these days just stick with reservations just to guarantee a certain amount of resources. So in a sort of deployment for OpenShift, you would allocate some dedicated resource, a resource pool for your masters, for example, or your control plane. So if you do start to run out of resources, that's protected. And then if you have particular workers that you want to schedule particular tasks to, and that you want to guarantee that that particular subset of workers has resources, you can put those into a resource pool and allocate that yourself. At the same time, you might want to tag those nodes that it's a special kind of node, so you can schedule workloads straight onto that node. And if you are filling up the cluster, you can guarantee those resources. Now, that's for a single ESXi host. Across a number of hosts in a cluster, DRS, which is the dynamic resource scheduler, is going to vMotion live migrate the machines around to make sure you've got the best possible utilization for that entire ESXi cluster. So it's going to balance out those workloads for compute and memory and I/O as you go across. So if you're resource constrained in the entire cluster, then things will move around, resource pools will kick in. So you've got the flexibility to overcommit resources, to say, I need to use 300 gigabytes of the 300 gigabytes of the 250 gigabytes I've got on this ESXi host, because I know that actually all of these VMs that are my OpenShift cluster aren't all going to be fully utilized all the time. I just want them to think that they have the resources, and the workloads will balance out appropriately. So it's just a way of protecting critical parts. I protect some of my workers. I protect the masters by giving them resource pools. But unless you are actually running out of memory, it's not going to kick in.
So I'll ask you, and I think you and I might have slightly different perspectives on this. So previously in multiple other streams, I've made the suggestion that overcommit for worker nodes specifically, essentially you should never overcommit the control plane nodes, but for worker nodes should be handled as close to the application as possible. So if I'm wanting to overcommit, oversubscribe my CPU and memory resources, so putting applications that have or want more CPU, more RAM than is available in the worker nodes, that should be done at the Kubernetes at the OpenShift level, and reserve or essentially protect the resources at the hypervisor level. But what you're saying is essentially let vSphere do what vSphere does.
Yeah. So, and it depends on your workload and how dynamic you want to be, and how, whether for a development cluster, for example, overcommit would make sense. If you're in a production cluster and you know the workload, you understand it, then maybe you don't overcommit. But with Kubernetes, when it schedules a workload, it says, have I got 50 gigs of RAM and this much CPU? And Kubernetes says, yes, I can schedule this pod here, and off you go. It doesn't go back and check. And that's just running. That resource is allocated to that workload. And if that workload doesn't actually use what you asked for, so it uses 1 gigabyte of RAM and almost no CPU, those resources are wasted. Now, vSphere ESX is constantly monitoring. It's constantly looking at memory utilization and CPU utilization. So it's going to rebalance. It's going to do some clever things with things like memory compression to make sure you get the most out of whatever workload is running on that platform. So you can safely overcommit memory, you can safely overcommit CPU, and OpenShift is completely unaware. It's quite happy. The only point you get to when it becomes interesting is when you do start to become resource constrained. ESX will do things like reduce the amount of CPU you have, so the VM will actually slow down, which will slow down the processing of your workload. And Linux and Kubernetes is completely unaware of that. It just starts to run a little bit slower. It does some time shifting on it to make sure every virtual machine gets a CPU cycle. And it does the same with hyperthreading as well. Hyperthreading is effectively half a cycle. On ESX, you don't get half a cycle. That thread will get scheduled twice if it lands on a hyperthread. So it does some really clever stuff. You can really get into it and get super nerdy if you want to get into CPU cycles and NUMA awareness and stuff like that. So you can really tune the performance of the cluster, or you can just overcommit a little bit and monitor it to see how it's going. But it can drop off very, very quickly. So to your point, Andrew, about being cautious and saying, look, don't overcommit resources. If your workload is, if you are actually using 32 gigs of RAM, you are using all that CPU all the time, then there's no benefit to overcommit. And the ESXi schedule is still going to try and deliver that capability. So if you know that workload is always going to be busy, don't overcommit it. Just say, right, this is a prod workload. This is how much it needs. Put it in a resource pool and it's fine. But for dev clusters or build clusters where you've got this fairly rapidly moving memory and CPU requirement as things get built and destroyed, you can get more bang for your buck on the hardware if you go with the overcommit.
Yeah, and I'll say, I want to get all nerdy and down in the weeds on that. I don't know if we have enough time, especially because we're continuing to get more questions. Thank you, everybody, for questions. We're going to address those. But I know you and I have talked about, creating some sort of, usually it's referred to as like a best practices guide or something like that, but more of a, I don't know if we want to call it best practices so much as here's what you need to know about OpenShift and VMware and stuff like that. So that's one of our background tasks that hopefully we'll get around to.
We should create a little video of overcommitting CPU and watching what it does.
Yeah,
that'd be fun.
Yeah. So JP Dade asks, and this is a question for you, Robbie, can we use VCF, vCloud Foundation with OpenShift 4.7?
That's easy. Yes. VCF is one of the supported platforms. You can create a workload domain for your OpenShift clusters. Drop that into a workload domain. Andrew's finding me some docs. There we go. And spin that up as you would any other workload domain. Use the cloud native storage driver to integrate your vSAN. If you want to do some stuff with NSX and plug that into OpenShift, you can do that as well, depending on what version of VCF you're running on. So yeah, it integrates really nicely. Andrew's kindly demonstrated that we even have documentation around how you do it and some best practices on that.
I was prepared to talk about it.
You were, weren't you?
So I see a question. I don't know if this one is VMware specific. Planning to buy a Ryzen 5000 series CPU with bare metal Core OS. Can I install OpenShift bare metal? Yes. I actually use Ryzen 2000 series in my home lab. So yes, Core OS does support those CPUs. And then the kernel version, it is the same as RHEL. So the simplest way to get the actual real current running kernel version, let me switch what I'm sharing here. Where'd you go? That guy. So I can do a OC get node. Come on. And do an OC debug against one of the nodes. So we'll just pick one of these guys. It'll pull down that debug pod here in just a moment. And once that comes up, we'll do just as it says here, we'll do a change root to /host. And then I can do like a simple uname -a. So you can see this brand new 4.7.2 node is running kernel 4.18.0-240. So pretty easy to find out the real actual running kernel. If it's not a running node, if it's not a running host that you can ask, it might be in the release notes. I'm not sure. So we would just have to check there. Let's see. I think you're working with
it. You want me to?
Rogomore?
Yeah, I got Rogomore
Okay.
handled. I think just pointing them to the container catalog was a huge help. So
Got it.
if you're trying to run containers as root in OpenShift, you're going to have problems, and that's okay.
Yeah.
We want you to have those problems because running everything as root is not a healthy practice.
Yep. Yeah, it's the whole security thing that we forcefully place upon you, whether you want it or not. Are infranodes declarable in the install config.yaml? Not in install config. You can create them in the manifests and have them deployed when the cluster is set up, but you still have to day 2 go in and modify the workloads to actually schedule onto them. Christian Hernandez did a great stream on this. Actually, I think he did one by himself, and I think he and I did one together. But it was last year. We'll dig up the links for those, and I'll put them into the show notes.
Thank you. If it was last year, holy smokes.
Yeah. It was. I want to say it was late summer, early fall last year.
Fair enough.
So, and for anybody who doesn't know, we do have a weekly blog post on openshift.com/blog. Goes out Friday morning where we recap everything that was in the show. We provide links to all the stuff that's here. So if you missed the links in the chat or anything like that, or if you didn't see something that I typed, you can always go back into that blog post and find all that information. Again, it publishes, thus far, it's always published Friday morning, early Friday morning. I say early Friday morning. It would actually be lunchtime for Robbie because you're over in the UK.
I've given up working out time zones. I just sit here forever.
I know. I always feel bad because I talk to you a lot in like what is effectively mid-afternoon for me. And I know that's like early evening, time for you. And you always brush it off as, oh, but I have to deal with, the West Coast time zone because that's, VMware stuff. And I still feel bad if I'm being honest.
Right. Has more questions around DRS here?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Okay. So there's I think I'm getting the questions in a different order to you guys, but there's one I want to call out here around affinity rules. So what should we do around how we manage affinity for control planes? Now, when you do a default install or IPI, UPI, OpenShift doesn't create any affinity rules at the vSphere level. So the VMs get spun up, but there's no affinity rules. If you want to start building a resiliency into it and making sure that your control planes are spread across physical ESXi hosts, you need to go into Virtual Center. You need to tag the VM and say, right, this is my first control plane. This is my second. This is my third. None of these folks can exist on the same ESXi host. At which point, if they're already on an ESXi host, vSphere will just vMotion them off, and they'll get put on physically different servers. So if you do lose a physical piece of tin, you're only going to lose one of those control nodes at a time. You can do exactly the same thing for workers. So if you have a bunch of different workers that you've tagged with different workloads, you can use affinity rules to spread those out across ESXi clusters. And depending on the size of your environment, that may also extend out to physical racks in the data center. So you can have a policy that will let you say, right, actually, I'm only going to have one control node VM per rack in my data center. And I'm going to put these workers across the ESXi hosts. So you can get quite sophisticated with your rule set as to where you want parts of OpenShift to be deployed, either in VCF or in just a homegrown, home-built vSphere environment. And vSphere is going to take care of that. OpenShift is not going to care. The only thing you need to be aware of course, is if you provision up a new OpenShift node, or you recreate a control plane that's gone, that doesn't have an affinity tag by default. So you need to go in and recreate it or use an automation to do that for you.
I hear Power
So
CLI is really cool.
Yeah, it's really CLI. The other thing to remember, which is a nice feature, is we've got a little tick box that says highly available. Tick that tick box for the control plane nodes, or any of the nodes really. That way, if we do lose a node because of a hardware failure or it just stops responding for whatever reason, vSphere will spin it up somewhere else immediately, and it's really, really quick at doing that. So if you lose a worker because of a hardware failure, vSphere can often put the worker back before OpenShift has realized that it's lost that node to start with. And then the Kubernetes layer will schedule pods and handle all of its internal workload magic as well. So they work really well together. But out of the box, those settings aren't turned on. So high availability for control plane, affinity rules to make sure you're not landing on particular physical hosts if you want that level of control.
And the only thing I'll add is I always recommend soft affinity rules, just in case, especially if you have relatively small number of nodes in the cluster. If you have a cluster that's only 3 nodes, DRS cluster, VMware cluster, that's only 3 nodes, and you set hard affinity rules for like the 3 control plane VMs, if one of those physical nodes goes down, then it won't restart that VM, that control plane VM, because it would violate that hard anti-affinity rule. If it's a soft anti-affinity rule, it'll restart it, and then when that physical capacity comes back, it'll automatically move it. So in the interest of time, I'm gonna rapid fire some questions here. So Daniel, and this is in referring to the CSI provisioner. The primary benefits come if you're using vSAN, then, right? So I will say my perspective is no. If you're using traditional data stores coming from whatever storage you're using, you still get a tremendous amount of visibility in vCenter as to what's going on with those PVs, right, that are inside of there. Robbie?
Yep, no, absolutely. If it's a data store in vSphere, you can apply the same storage policies that you can with your traditional data stores, as you can with vSAN. We talk about vSAN obviously because it's our thing, but yeah, anything that's a data store in vSphere, CNS is going to take care of it for you, and you get that visibility at the VMware level. So it's not just tied down to vSAN.
And you said CNS there, which is I
Sorry.
don't think we've explained that what CNS is and how it relates.
Cool. Yeah, so cloud native storage versus the just the driver.
Yeah, and cloud native storage, or CNS, is what VMware calls the CSI driver, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's its
We have lots of fun with terminology. Let's talk about clusters, yeah. Andrew.
Is it possible to change cloud providers of an existing cluster? Unfortunately, no. I wish that were possible. It would solve a lot of support headaches for us. Why such hate for DHCP? I don't know. I wish I knew. Andrew's opinion is there's a lot of old school think about DHCP, right? It was never used in the data center for security reasons, right? Anybody can just go in and plug in and get an IP address and stuff like that. But that being said, that's just my opinion. I find DHCP to be very helpful. But then again, these days I just run a lab. I don't run a data center anymore. So
right. I got one here for you. Are infranodes declarable in the install-config YAML yet?
We addressed that one. So unfortunately, no.
We did. No.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
So you can create them at install time. Just quick revisit. You can create them at install time by putting the machine set YAMLs into the manifest file. So you would do a OpenShift install create manifest and then dump them in there. So it would provision them, but you would have to go in after the fact and modify the services to actually deploy over there.
Mm-hmm.
GP data, see that I debug into the node. I've used SSH to access the nodes. So what is your preferred way of accessing the nodes? It's one more dangerous than the other. So I tend to use the debug simply because it's easier.
Yeah.
I don't have to, use a specific or provide the specific SSH ID. I don't have to constantly go in and edit my known hosts because I deploy clusters 3 or 4 times a day sometimes. And if I'm SSHing into those nodes, I'm constantly having to go in and remove them. So generally speaking, I use OC debug into the nodes probably 95% of the time. There are occasionally some things like if you need to access devices, like if I need to check and see whether or not it detected a USB device that I plugged in. A lot of times that type of stuff I will have to SSH in. And I see Christian answered that question as well.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to control different cluster architectures in one panel? For example, I have 3 clusters. I think that we have ACM. Sorry, I started to read the question and then it broke up a little, I think. So I think you might have asked or might have helped answer that one, Chris. ACM would be the...
Yeah, I mean, ACM would be the Red Hat answer to that.
Yeah.
But like if it's like you need to give your developers a view, into all the clusters versus like the admin side where it's, the ops side. It kind of depends on what you're trying to do.
I think this is, and Andrew needs to get more familiar with ACM. But I think what you're thinking is like, where's my vCenter? It's like in vCenter, right? I can have multiple clusters. Like, could I have, cluster 1 in here, and then this is my, OpenShift admin console or whatever for that cluster, and go down to cluster 2 and see that one. And so one interface where I can join all of my clusters to be able to manage them. Or same thing with Cockpit, right? Cockpit, I can have one host that is my Cockpit host that connects to other hosts and is able to do those things. So I'm showing you this, and I just realized that I'm not sharing that window.
Lovely. Thank you.
So anyway, so no, unfortunately, ACM is the closest thing I know of. But again, I'm not super familiar with ACM, so that might not meet your needs in that.
So
instance.
Christian says, my answer to everything is Argo CD. GitOps does solve a lot of problems along that route, and you can definitely have that kind of all-in-one view with Argo across multiple nodes. I feel like, not sure.
So I see a question, and Robbie, I don't know if you know of anything here. Are there any Kubernetes enhancements that will have insight into the fact or danger that the Kubernetes nodes are running on the same physical host?
Ooh,
That's an excellent question.
Yes,
I know there's a lot of talk on the SIG about it, but I don't know if anything's actually
would be affinity rules, right? Like in Kubernetes
Yeah.
itself, but
That would be an interesting RFE for the cloud provider, maybe, having the cloud provider be
Yeah.
able to either report that information or even configure affinity rules.
So the latest blog post on this is from Kubernetes side. Well, it's documentation, but I'll just link it here just to, for posterity, but they're kind of going through like, how would you do this currently? And, node isolation restrictions, affinity and anti-affinity rules are all in play there.
Yeah. So Waleed, I see HA fault tolerance. So yeah, HA and FT are not necessarily the same thing. Fault tolerance is fault tolerance is it is the same VM executing on two separate hosts at the same time. So if one of the hosts fails, the other one picks it up and runs with it immediately. And to your point, Waleed, there is a limit of 8 CPUs per VM for that. And using FT, while it's fine if you need it, be aware of two things. One, it uses a lot of network throughput, right, to replicate all of those CPU
There's some
instructions.
very specific requirements on FT.
And it is super latency sensitive.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've ever tested it with OpenShift, or even in fact with Kubernetes, because HA typically puts things back and before Kubernetes cares.
Suggest any tools to deploy an OpenShift cluster in one click, apart from Ansible?
Yeah, I'm just answering that right now, right? Like I'm thinking of a small, lightweight kind of like Argo CD cluster, like a Kubernetes and Docker kind of scenario.
Actually, Robbie, is there anything in the vRealize realm that can do that?
Yeah, I mean, we can use vRealize automation to do the one-click button that kicks off the deployment for you. There's some stuff up front that you obviously have to provide with the configuration. I mean, Andrew, we messed around with it with the UPI installer and created ignition files and automated that stuff. IPI, I think it's fairly trivial to do, actually.
Yeah, IPI, it isn't one click, but it's one command, and then you fill out like your what's your vCenter, what's your credentials, and what IPs do you want to use, and it kind of goes.
Yeah, and vRealize will automatically provide all that stuff. So we don't have anything out of the box because vRealize is mostly around what does your environment look like, how do you want to automate it. But we have got customers that have that one click. Normally we use it with some governance wrapped around it. So the one-click deployment is more around, are you allowed to deploy that 32 node OpenShift cluster, or perhaps do you want to get someone's permission first?
Yeah. So we've only got about 5 minutes left. Robbie, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, we know that there's we generally encourage folks to use CSI. For customers who have NSX, right? We generally encourage using NSX integrations. Are there other things that maybe in the VMware portfolio or in the Red Hat portfolio, right, ways that those two things can integrate and get kind of more value, more benefit?
Yeah, I mean, we spend a lot of time talking to customers that have a lot of the other solutions in the portfolio that are normally VM based, but we've been moving everything to kind of be a more container focused over the last few years. So I'm going to take the opportunity to share a slide and share a screen. So give me a sec, and I will.
So our anti-affinity, I'm going back to questions here. Andrew, you can handle this one. Are anti-affinity rules recommended on the OpenShift, plane, the entire OpenShift cluster, or should you do it with VMs and VMware, right? Like, what's the right answer there?
So I would say Andrew's opinion is that anti-affinity rules, soft anti-affinity rules, are strongly recommended for the control plane nodes. Probably for infrastructure nodes, if you're using those, definitely ones that are running routers. And then worker nodes, it's really going to depend on you and your applications and a number of other things. One of the things a conversation for another time is, the philosophy of, do I, if I'm deploying OpenShift to vSphere or really any virtual infrastructure, right? Do I have fewer larger nodes, maybe one VM per physical host, or do I have more smaller nodes where maybe I end up with 3 or 4 or 5 OpenShift worker nodes per physical host, and kind of the benefits and stuff there. So, but I don't want to interrupt from what Robbie was going to say.
I mean,
Yeah,
that's another great topic, right? I mean, I'm going to just, if you guys, can you see that? Is that working?
Yes.
Perfect. So, I mean, we've been talking mostly around just the vSphere cloud provider stuff, which is the stuff at the bottom here, where it's vSphere and VMs, right? I mean, we talked a bit about CNS, cloud CSI drivers for vSAN and storage. NSXT integration gives us the sort of full view into the pod networks as it does the VM networks. So the bottom part is very much about giving you the view that you have with VMs, but at the OpenShift level, and making everything kind of have a level playing field. But the other thing we've been working on a lot is, how do you do day 2, and how do you see the OpenShift workloads, the applications that are running OpenShift alongside all of your other workloads. So feeding all the logs into something like Log Insight or Log Insight Cloud, along with ESX logs, along with VM workload logs, and getting that end-to-end view, so you can see if the database that's sitting in Oracle somewhere that you've never touched for the last decade is causing you a problem with your microservices in OpenShift, for example, is where we've been focusing some of these integrations. So observability, our Wavefront was one of the first operators that we got certified on Operator Hub, actually, Andrew. Yep. So you can go into OpenShift, go to Operator Hub and say, give me Wavefront, and that's going to give you the dashboards, the real-time view on OpenShift alongside vCenter and vSphere and vSAN and any other VMs that you've got in the environment. So, we focus very much on making sure OpenShift works around everything and plugs in the way you'd expect it to. So, I mean, we don't really have time to go into any of this stuff, but there's lots of other things beyond just the cloud provider interface that we've been working on.
Yeah, awesome. I know, having, and at the bottom of your slide there, you had the OpenShift on VMC on VMware Cloud on AWS. Oh, yeah. That one's near and dear to my heart because you and I have worked on that one together and published that. So anybody who's a VMC customer and they want to deploy OpenShift onto VMC, that's now a fully supported platform. Robbie and I went through and did the deployment guide for that. And, that was where I got re-familiarized with like Log Insight. The last time I used Log Insight was, this is 2021. So 9 years ago. And it was a great product then. I can only assume it's only gotten better, in many ways, but it was one of those, like, I'd forgotten it existed. And you can absolutely configure, OpenShift to, if you don't want to use the OpenShift logging service for whatever reason, if you've got Log Insight, you've already got one. Do you want to use 2? Maybe not. But you can absolutely configure OpenShift to only forward to Log Insight or to go to both, right? To the OpenShift cluster logging service and to Log Insight, so on and so forth. So
yes, and it comes up sometimes where you just want the operations folks to have their logs in one place, and then the dev guys have their logs somewhere else, and everyone has their favorite.
So I think we are at the top of the hour now. Thank you everybody for all of your really phenomenal questions.
Great session.
I'm going to take as many of these as I can. I'm going to put them into the blog post. I'll try and link to where we answer them in the video as best as I can. If you have any additional questions, if there's anything we didn't get to, you can always reach out to me or Chris. So social media, I am at Practical Andrew on Twitter. Chris is at Chris Short. You can also send an email, andrew.sullivan@redhat.com. Robbie, is there, you're on Twitter as well?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. Hit me up on Robbie J on Twitter. And I'll work with Andrew to answer as many questions as we can. This was a lot of fun. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, we'll have to do it again. So thank you very much, Robbie. Appreciate you joining us. And to our audience, thank you. And we will see you tomorrow for the What's Next presentation, and next week at the same great time, same great channel.
Yes, and I would like to remind everybody that Red Hat Summit is coming. So please register for that if you are interested in attending. Thank you. And without further ado, I will turn everything off. Thank you, Robbie, for joining us. Really appreciate it, buddy.
Thank you very much.